Okay, so we'll pick up in lecture video B with renal circulation. So the renal artery, of course, is how blood is delivered into the kidney. It divides and branches into segmental arteries. Okay, so there are three types of segmental arteries. You have interlobar arteries that go up the columns, which are the areas in between the pyramids. You have the arcuate arteries, which go over the pyramids. And then you have interlobular arteries, which go all the way up into the cortex. Okay, well, each of these segmental arteries branch into afferent arterioles. Each afferent arteriole supplies one nephron. Now we're going to get to nephron in just a second. Nephron is the functional unit of the kidney, and there's about 1.5 million in each kidney. So these are all the individual units of the kidney. Now, that afferent arteriole leads to a ball of capillaries. We call this the glomerulus. The ball of capillaries, which are the blood vessels, is the glomerulus, which is inside of each nephron. Now, blood is drained from the glomerulus by efferent arterioles, and efferent arterioles are a lot smaller in diameter than afferent. So basically, more blood moves into the kidney than comes out of the kidney. But again, once we get into the kidney, we're filtering out some of that filtrate. They each lead to peritubular capillaries, which are around the portion of the renal tube, which is part of the nephron. There's also interlobular veins or directly into the arcuate veins, which lead into the interlobar veins, and then finally into the renal vein. The renal vein leaves through the hilum, and it goes back into the inferior vena cava. And here's a really good picture. So basically, blood leaves the aorta, travels throughout the body. It enters the renal artery, and then, which is right here, the red renal artery. Here is the segmental artery where they start breaking up. Okay. You can also see the interlobar arteries, which go up through the columns. And then you have your arcuate vessels, arteries, which go over the pyramids, and then you have your interlobular, which are going to go all the way into the cortex. So we go from the aorta to the renal artery, the segmental arteries, the interlobar, the arcuate, which is in between which in the columns, the arcuate, which is over the pyramids, and the cortical radiate, which we learned that interlobular is also over the cortex. And then we go into each individual nephron, which is through the afferent arteriole, that it gets into glomerulus. The glomerulus is actually where the blood is filtered. Okay, so once we filter the blood, the kidney decides what to keep, what to put in. Blood now, it's time for it to leave the kidney. So it's going to go through the efferent arteriole, through the peritubular capillaries, the corticate radiate vein, which is basically the interlobular vein, which is in the cortex, through the arcuate vein, which is in the pyramid, and then the interlobar vein, which is in the column, finally through the renal vein, and then the inferior vena cava returned back to the heart. So that's the pathway of blood flow to the kidney, through it, and then, of course, out of the kidney. Here is microcirculation of the kidney. In the cortex, you have peritubular capillaries that branch off the efferent arterioles, and they supply the tissue near the glomerulus. And you can see here, this is showing you a picture of the nephron. Here is the glomerulus, which is actually called the renal corpuscle, and here's the loop. You have the PCT, the nephron loop, and then the DCT. These two parts, this big tube called the renal tubule and the renal corpuscle, make up one nephron. Okay, so that's and that's what we're leading up to, what we're about to get to. So nerve supply to the kidney is similar. It enters similar to how blood enters the kidney. The renal nerves enter through the hilum. They follow along the renal artery into the individual nephrons, and of course they regulate blood flow into and out of the nephron as well. Okay, so let's get to the nephron. Each kidney has over 1 million nephrons, and these are, of course, the functional units. Now, there are basically two big parts, the renal corpuscle and the renal tubule. The renal corpuscle filters the blood. That's where the blood is actually filtered. The renal tubule is a long coil tube that converts the filtrate into urine. And this is actually what leads into the ureters, into the bladder, and out of the body. Now, the renal corpuscle, let's talk about the anatomy and what it consists of. It is composed of that glomerulus, which of course is all the blood capillaries. It also has a glomerular Bowman capsule. This capsule just simply encloses the glomerulus. You, of course, have an outer and an inner layer of that capsule. The parietals, the outer, the viscerals, the inner. You have a space in between those two layers called the capsular space. The glomerular filtrate collects in that space, then it flows into the renal tubule. Okay, the renal corpuscle, I call it the ball because to me it looks like a ball. Okay, you have a vascular pole, which is the side of the corpuscle where the blood enters, the afferent arteriole enters the corpuscle, and the blood leaves through the efferent arteriole. And then the other side of the ball, you have the urinary pole. And this is where the renal tube begins, and the filtrate that the glomerulus filtered out of the blood enters into the tube where it can be turned into urine. Okay, so here's a great picture. This is the ball, which is the renal corpuscle. Okay, the glomerular filtrate is going to accumulate in the capsular space. Here is the space. You see where my mouse is flowing. There's the space. Okay, here's the parietal layer. Here's the space, and then of course here's the visceral layer, which lines this brown stuff. Okay, now the glomerulus is this bracket. This is where all the blood capillaries are. You can see those glomerular capillaries where the red blood cells are showing. Okay, you also have the vascular pole, which here's the afferent arteriole, blood flows in. The efferent arteriole, once it goes all through this corpuscle, it comes out through the efferent. Notice the afferent is bigger than the efferent. That's the vascular pole. Over here you have the urinary pole. This right here, this brown tube, this is the PCT, which is the beginning of the renal tubule where the filtrate that's been filtered from this glomerulus, from the corpuscle, it's going to go into the PCT, into the tube, and eventually is turned into urine. Okay, so again, this is an excellent image of the renal corpuscle. Okay, and then the other part of the nephron is called the renal tubule. All right. Now, the tubule is literally a duct that leads away from the glomerular capsule or corpuscle, and it ends at the top of the medullary pyramid. There are 4 regions to this renal tube. The PCT, which is the proximal convoluted tubule, the nephron loop, the DCT, which is the distal convoluted tubule. All 3 of those are parts of one nephron. Now, the 4th region of the renal tubule is called the collecting duct. The collecting duct receives fluid from many nephrons. So the PCT, the loop, and the DCT are all of one nephron, but when you get several nephrons, they all feed into one collecting duct. So the DCTs of several nephrons are going to unload that filtrate and that fluid into the collecting duct. And then the collecting duct, of course, is where it turns it into urine. So we're going to look at all 4 of these parts separately. We'll start with the PCT, which is the proximal convoluted tubule. This is the tube that we just looked at that's connected to the ball, connected to that glomerular capsule. It's longer and it's really coiled. There's a lot of microvilli, which is called the brush border. That increases the surface area, which increases the majority of absorption. Then you go to the loop. The nephron loop is also called the loop of Henle. It is a long U-shaped portion of the renal tube. There's a descending limb which goes down, and then when it turns and picks back up, we call that the ascending limb. Okay. Now we also have a thick segment and a thin segment. The thick segment is simple cuboidal. It's the very beginning of the descending limb. It's the initial part of the descending limb, okay? And it's part or all of the ascending limb. All right, and you'll see a picture in just a second. This has a lot of mitochondria, and it is very heavily engaged in the active transport of salts, sodium, potassium, and chlorine, not water. So at this point in the tube, salts can come in and out, but water does not. So there's not a lot of active transport of water. Now, the thin segment is basically the bottom of the loop. It's a lower part of the descending limb, and then it starts as it curves back up to go up again, the ascending. It's going to turn back into the thick filament. Now, this is where the cells are very permeable to water. Okay, so you need to remember that. Thick segment, a lot of salt transport. Thin segment, a lot of water transport. And then you get to the DCT, which begins right after the ascending limb. It is a lot shorter and less coiled than the DCT, and this marks the end of the nephron. There are no microvilli in the DCT. And then we get the collecting duct, and of course I told you it receives fluid from several DCTs of the nephrons, and it passes it back to the medulla. They actually converge and form the papillary duct, and of course this is eventually going to lead it into the ureter. Okay, so here's the flow of fluid from the point where the filtrate is formed in the glomerulus to the point where urine leaves the body. And this is really, really important to trace this flow of fluid. This is putting a lot of the urinary system kind of together, putting the pieces together here. So once the blood enters the glomerular capsule, blood is filtered and we now form filtrate. So filtrate leaves the glomerular capsule, enters into the PCT. Then it goes into the nephron loop, then it goes into the DCT, then the collecting duct. Then it goes into the papillary duct, the minor calyx, the major calyx, the renal pelvis, the ureter, the bladder, and then the urethra. Okay, now again, that goes from the very inner part of the kidney all the way out of the kidney to the ureter, to the bladder, to the urethra. Very, very important here. Now, let's look at that nephron again, because this is a nephron. Okay, this yellow deal here is the nephron. Now, look at the pyramid. This is kind of gives you a good place as to where in the world are we at in the kidney. We are right at the border, right above the border of in between the pyramid and the cortex. So here's the ball, the renal corpuscle. You can see the capsule, and you can also see the glomerulus. Okay, notice we have blood coming in and blood goes out. Blood comes in the afferent, which is bigger. Blood leaves the efferent once it's been filtered. So once blood's filtered, filtrate goes into the PCT, which is this coiled region. Here is the nephron loop. Notice descending limb, ascending limb. Notice thick segment, thin segment, thick segment again. Then we go to the DCT, and then of course we go into the collecting duct. Excellent, excellent image of the anatomy of the nephron. Now, here it talks about the two different types of nephrons. You have cortical and juxtamedullary nephrons. I want you to know that almost all of them are cortical, which is 85%, and that means they're located mainly in that cortex region, which is what we just looked at. All right, that concludes Lecture A. In Lecture B, we will pick up with urine formation.